Kia ora. Today we're going to be taking a look at what we've been doing wrong, but also what we can do right in order to meet the microbial limits of the New Zealand minimum quality standards for medicinal cannabis. My name is Josiah, you can call me Joe or Chill. I run Chill Division, and what I'm going to do real quick is just remove the webcam from here so we can see everything on screen. So I run a small startup with the intention of bringing locally cultivated product to the domestic market. I want to empower as many mom and pop's cultivation facilities as I can, each with their own variety of strains, so that we can bring more niche and more artisanal product to consumers. I also do consulting for legacy cultivators who are interested in starting their own facility. You can find me at chilldivision.co.nz or on Instagram at chill.division.nz. So, let's start this off. What makes me think that this is going to work where many others have struggled so much in the past? Well, I've basically got proof. We've had 3 separate illicit grows, all of which were done in a combination of an office, a garage, and an attic, have provided me with dried samples. Now, without doing any other preventative measures, with a single treatment, all of these came back at 50 CFUs per gram or lower. This is with a single treatment of 0.5%, and it was tested by Hill Labs multiple times. So the theory is that without any other major changes, the remainder of section 5.1.4 should actually be attainable now. So what are we talking about when we're talking about section 5.1.4? Well, we're talking about the current regulatory limits under the European Pharmacopoeia, specifically the 10th edition, which New Zealand has adopted for medicinal cannabis products. So when we're looking here, specifically the part that's in red for inhalation, 10 to the power of 2 is 200 CFUs per gram for TAMC, the total aerobic microbial count, or 10 to the power of 1, which is 20 for the total yeasts and molds. Arguably this is more sterile than like your hospital operating theater, so it's a tough nut to crack. So here are some common treatment methods and their shortcomings. So what I'm going to do is absolutely fly through these because there's quite a lot of them and we don't need to go into the specifics. You can always pause the video or come back to this later on. So we'll start off with some of the positives about each thing, and then further down the screen we will have some of the more negative aspects. So let's start with positive pressurization, or even sometimes completely sealing the grow room. It's pretty easy to positively pressurize, but you've got to have a filter box for your air intake prior to pressurizing the room, or otherwise the whole thing is semi-pointless. It doesn't stop things being walked in on bodies of staff, for example. And it's actually kind of expensive and difficult to fully seal a room and set up all the additional environmental controls that it's required. Realistically, you're using this to stop bugs, not bacteria. Best practice cleanliness and PPE, so it's going to be great. It's going to protect the plants from the primary problem being humans, but we're more talking about things like HLVD or TMV, tobacco mosaic virus, for example, rather than any other bacteria. It can be costly with expensive ongoing aspects to it. Painter suits suck. We've got also the fact that COVID has shown most people are pretty damn useless when it comes to mask wearing. They're either going to be poorly fitted, the wrong types, or they're going to wear them as a chin diaper and under their nose. Breathing out their nose is basically going to unravel the whole thing and make it kind of pointless. So it is pretty easy for staff to mess up if they are careless. Hydrogen peroxide, relatively cost effective, which is cool, sufficiently safe enough. It can be added into feed or sprayed in the air via foliar or through your humidifier, which is cool. Unfortunately, though, it does have a pretty short half-life, both in the air and in the water, which means it's less effective. And it only impacts the places on the plant that it directly comes into contact with. In addition to this, it also breaks down very rapidly with light, and given this is going to be applied in a cultivation room, that's kind of also a problem. And lastly, it can be a bit of an irritant if it is inhaled. Ozone, pretty cheap and pretty straightforward. You put an ozone generator in the room and that's about all that you can do. But it can be pretty difficult to move it around the room appropriately. It's also incredibly easy to burn the leaf or the flower and the plant itself. It's toxic to humans, which is not good, which means you've got to schedule it, you've got to turn it on at night, and then leave the room for a sufficient amount of time so that you don't breathe it in when you return. It's basically it's more of a spray and pray, and it's not going to penetrate very well. Ultraviolet light. In short, this is probably the only one where I've basically just said there's not a lot of point when it comes to indoor cannabis cultivation, so just don't bother, basically. UVA has real sanitation benefits. UVC has minimal to none, certainly not at the levels that we're applying it. So, given you're going to fry your staff and your plants, it's not worth it. HEPA filtration and internal recirculation of air is moderately effective at stopping bugs and bacteria, which is pretty cool. Really cheap and easy to get underway with, though. Really, you just whack it in the corner and off you go. The downside, though, is that this is going to require positive pressure to realistically work correctly and a decent amount of ongoing maintenance as you clean it all out. It's not going to catch all the bacteria as well, because if the bacteria is on the plants, the fan is not going to specifically suck it off the plant. It's mostly going to catch that which is already floating around the air. For example, if you are breathing, if your staff happen to have pulled down their mask, for example. So the overall efficacy isn't terribly great given what we want. Hypochlorous acid is pretty cool, though. It's arguably the best of the lot that we've looked at so far. Non-toxic, not considered an irritant like hydrogen peroxide, breaks down into harmless components. You can do it in your feed or do it in foliar, but again, it's not sufficiently effective on its own as with hydrogen peroxide. It's also not permitted by the Ministry of Health, which is not ideal, so because we can't use it in a licensed facility here in New Zealand as part of our IPM, that kind of rules it out. You could potentially get away with arguing that it's for use for cleaning and things like that, but yeah, good luck. So let's take a look at peracetic acid, and while peracetic acid, or PAA, is not a silver bullet, it comes pretty damn close. So at this point, we're going to go through and we're going to look at all of these individual points, specifically because I think they warrant discussion and knowing about peracetic acid. So it's very inexpensive to apply, like very, very, very inexpensive. You can buy enough concentrate to run a few thousand square meters worth for $100 sort of thing. It's going to break down into pretty harmless components within 24 to 48 hours, depending on the strength of application and the strength of dilution. It's highly effective at treating microbial load with a 7-log reduction, so that's 99.99999% reduction. Again, this is going to depend on your concentration and application methodology. You can use it during cultivation as well as post-harvest, which is fantastic, and it is significantly better at reaching into the flower crevices compared to most of the other things that we've talked about. Even though it's made up of hydrogen peroxide and acetic acid, it's better than hydrogen peroxide alone at reaching into the flower. I'm not entirely too sure why. I believe it has to do with the acetic acid mix, but whatever. It's considered an organic treatment in certain parts of the world. However, depending on if you are looking to export, it may pay to check with your jurisdiction if they're okay with the use of it. Again, because it is hydrogen peroxide based, and, well, acetic acid is vinegar, so it's a food product. Really good at suppressing the growth of Salmonella, E. coli, Listeria. Now, so far there has been no observed impact to cannabinoid or terpene levels when we're doing it at concentrations between 0.5 and 1%, which is perfect. That's what we wanted to see. You can apply it multiple times during growth. You're not limited to just one application. It can also be applied to stored product if you happen to have already harvested it. For example, you've dried, you've cured, you've put some aside, but it's failed on your microbial levels, you could still apply it post-storage. Now, because there's not going to be any residue or anything left, it doesn't require any wash afterwards, which is also fantastic. And unlike certain other sterilization products, this will work even under 4 degrees Celsius, which is pretty cool too. The downsides are that this will be an irritant if you inhale it directly. So proper PPE is required, especially during the mixing or dilution down of your acetic acid plus hydrogen peroxide. And frankly, it's going to smell like shit. It is basically vinegar on steroids. If you think about it like that, it will smell strong. It will leave no residue on the plant, but it will smell pretty strong for a day. So some observations from the winery industry. How did this impact on grapes and things like that? Well, there were minor visual impacts, but that was only after repeated and aggressive application throughout the cultivation outdoors. In this particular example that I'm referring to, that I could find some published information on, they did 5 applications in 4 weeks, which is a lot. what we're specifically talking about here with our recommendations for medicinal cannabis products might be up to 3 across, say, an 8 to 9 week cycle, which is quite different. Now, there was no taste, taint, or impact, or anything along those lines. This was tested by wine sommeliers and experts based on wines that were made with the grapes that had been treated with peracetic acid. They did notice that there was a slight loss of sheen and a minor browning after several of the applications, though, so that's something to keep in mind. However, at low rates, we haven't noticed anything yet with medicinal cannabis in our limited testing. So, really good question. Why isn't this being used overseas? Well, predominantly if we look at the United States, for example, they rely on a higher CFU count. Most states require you maintain under either 10,000 or 100,000 CFUs per gram. For comparison, here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, our limit is 200 CFUs per gram for TAMC. So quite a difference. And for the most part, they can get away with just hydrogen peroxide at foliar sprayed, or they'll have certain things that are up on the wall which generate hydrogen peroxide. So peracetic acid has been used on fruits and vineyards, kiwi fruit, apples, oranges, strawberries, and things like that. So it's not like it's new. It just hasn't really been used on cannabis products. It has been used though since the 50s in strawberry packaging. I believe they would ship it across from Scotland across Europe and things like that. They would apply it, package it, send it, and that way the strawberries would arrive at the destination still looking nice and fresh. Ever since the 50s and the 60s. Now, other countries basically just look at things like bleach, or often use gamma and E-beam irradiation, sometimes the cryopasteurization wash, as more of like a blunt instrument treatment, just to ensure that no matter what happens with their cultivation, that it comes out okay. We'd like to avoid that, obviously. So here's a picture of peracetic acid being applied to oranges, just to give you some insights into other areas. It has been used, though. And strawberries. So on the left, what happens if you don't apply peracetic acid to your strawberries? Well, they're going to arrive at the destination moldy and covered in bacteria looking like that, which nobody wants. On the right-hand side, though, that's what happens after a application of peracetic acid before packaging and shipping. So it arrives at the consumer looking fresh, which is cool. So, how do we know that peracetic is actually effective at minimizing microbial load? We've actually got a lot of test results from Hill Labs, which is pretty cool, and I was able to find some published information on Terasep, which is a peracetic acid-based product, and the efficacy. So if we have a look at the chart here, so when applied at 0.3% concentration, they noticed an 8.3 log reduction in E. coli, an 8.6 log reduction in Listeria, a 7.3 log reduction, and 6.95. We could probably round that up to 7 and just be generous, but... So, again, depending on the concentration of the application, will result in a different log reduction of microbial load. So, what we did was we received a sample. It was still wet at the time, from a legacy cultivator. Now, we basically took it and we waited for it to go moldy, intentionally. This came back, though, after a single... I mean, you can see in the picture, it's moldy, like, it's nasty. Now, this came back after a single treatment, I believe it was at 0.5%, with under 5 CFUs per gram. So basically, the minimum amount that they could detect, they weren't detecting any. Similarly, for BTGN, your bile-tolerant gram-negative bacteria was not detected. This, despite it being visibly moldy. So the total yeast and molds was 400,000. Now, if you'll recall, we have a limit of 20, so there's no way that this is going to pass. However, a couple of things worth noting here. We weren't entirely too sure if this was fully dried before sending it off, but this was the last one that we received, so we had to send it off in a hurry. And if you compare to the fact that we know a lot of outdoor cultivated hemp and other cannabis-based products come back in the millions and still don't visibly look moldy, the fact that this only has 400,000 CFU per gram is actually shocking, like incredibly surprising. So, very encouraging there. So, like I mentioned, we received a few samples from legacy growers. These are what you would consider raw cultivation. So there was no other PPE, there was no other humidifying with hydrogen peroxide, there was no gloves worn, no internal recirculation, no nothing. Basically just kind of done probably in a tent. If you look at the shed, so these were all then treated with a single application of peracetic acid afterwards, when the product was dry or drying. So if we look at the shed, it came back with a CFU count for TAMC of 35 and the use of molds at 300. The office cultivated one came back at 5 with the use of molds of 200. So these are all within striking distance, basically, of the NZMQS standards. We've met the TAMC, which is the first line there, the aerobic plate count, and it's just the yeast and molds now. And with a proper application, a more refined application of peracetic acid, this should work. The hilarious thing is, in hindsight, we realized we didn't actually spin the bud around as we were doing this. So realistically, all that we did was we sprayed what amounted to a top-down spray. We didn't actually spray the bottom. So again, further refinement should improve these. Now, we note that the wet one that we shipped off that was wet, this is a different one from the previous image. It was bagged wet, and so we still saw the rapid growth, even though this wasn't done in a vacuum sealed bag. It was just kind of a Ziploc bag, effectively, if you will. So if you don't get all of it, we do see it start to grow back pretty quickly. Very interesting, we thought. Anyway, so that's pretty exciting. Again, if we can get under 200 CFUs per gram, doing nothing but a single broad strokes application, very crude, of peracetic acid, then I can't imagine how much better we'd be able to do in a licensed facility, especially after we've refined the peracetic acid application method. So what else should you be doing? So here's what is hopefully a very holistic and realistic multi-pronged approach to sanitation that should help cultivators meet the New Zealand minimum quality standards. So some practical steps you can take. Don't flush your product. If you are removing the nutrients for a week or 2 weeks or anything along those lines, if your SOPs require it, you should probably look at changing them. Now, the reason for this is because what you will find is that as the mobile elements are sucked from the fan leaves and the sugar leaves, what we see is there is a necrosis which predominantly occurs at the base of the stem where it attaches to the main branch or trunk. And that's how you get bud rot and botrytis. It's one of the main ways that it starts, especially because hopefully everybody has nice thick buds and you are not going to be able to see it. It's going to be more difficult for the peracetic acid to get into and things. So if you're flushing, again, there's no strong evidence that there's any benefit to doing that, but there is strong evidence that that will increase your mold count. If there is anything that moves air or moves air through it, such as your air conditioning, your dehumidifiers, your wind socks, your fans, all that kind of thing, they need regular cleaning, ideally more than just once per season, because let's say you get a little bit of buildup on the front of your dehumidifier of bacteria. What's going to happen is, as it blows that out the front of it, it's going to continuously just blow that bacteria over your plants. And that's bad. So do a regular cleaning, ideally more than once per season, but at an absolute minimum, all of that needs to be being cleaned seasonally. Use peracetic acid. From the looks of it, 1% is what the recommendation has come back at when we've had discussions with other fruits, vineyards, that kind of thing. From the sounds of things, it appears as though if we're trying to keep in the mindset of an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, then doing it at the first day of flower as the flower buds start to form. Prior to forming. Day 21 of flower as most of them have formed and they will simply be bulking up after that. And also at harvest time, be it like a day before harvest or something. Post-harvest can work too, especially after you've gone and trimmed, if you're doing a wet trim, that sort of thing, so that's pretty cool. But again, it's worth covering your plant's growing medium. If you have, for example, cocoa perlite and you're noticing that your perlite is going green, that's because you've got algae. Now, algae in and of itself isn't specifically a bad bacteria. However, it often does go hand in hand with it, so what you should look at doing is covering it. Similarly, the rock wool, again, cover your rock wool. You don't want to be having a ton of algae growing on the top of it. Even doing things like flushing hypochlorous acid through it will be hugely beneficial there, but covering it is easier. So what are we going to be doing at Chill Division? Well, we're going to be doing a number of things, specifically with the intention of not just relying on one particular aspect. So we're going to positively pressurize a mantrap prior to all cultivation rooms. Now this mantrap will be internally HEPA filtered on the intake, as well as internally recirculated through another HEPA filter. Because why not? It's super easy to do, we might as well. We'll go with nitrile gloves and N95 masks, but at this point it doesn't look like we're going to need the painter suits or anything like that. And given how awful they make things, we'll review this in time. We will be covering any and all places that water sits, like reservoirs, rock wool, that sort of thing. And we'll run hypochlorous acid through the lines and onto the rock wool. We'll be doing internally scrubbing of the air in the grow room itself as well, with both carbon filters and HEPA filters, because, again, that's going to get rid of the smell and any other bacteria that happens to be flying through the air. We'll do regular cleaning of the ACs, the wind tunnels, the dehumidifiers, the humidifiers, the fans on the wall, and by regular, we're probably thinking 3 times the growth cycle at the moment, so that's monthly, basically. We're looking specifically at doing 3 treatments of peracetic acid at between 0.5 and 1%. Potentially, there's not specifically a need for us to do it at day 1 of flower, but given the flower itself isn't formed yet, there's kind of a, well, why not mentality. So definitely looking at day 21 of flower and like the day of harvest or the day before harvest. After this as well, we'll be vacuum sealing the dried product with a nitrogen backfill, because the nitrogen backfill is also very good at ensuring there is no additional growth once it's been sealed. So thanks for tuning in. Really appreciate everybody watching this. Please feel free to ask any comments in the comment section below. Ask any questions in the comment section below, or the replies on Instagram. You can send us a message at chill.division.nz. Hit us up. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Love to answer any other questions for you. And don't forget, hit the subscribe button, because we'll be coming out with more things like this in the near future. Until next time, cheers.